All right, welcome again. And what we're going to do for the next few weeks is enter the labyrinth. And as we move through this labyrinth, we'll come into dark places, long, dark hallways and winding stairs that lead into strange places, tunnels carved for particular purposes. And I think when you see what the purposes are and you begin to share with me each turn, each twist, each turn, and then also you'll find that the labyrinth is not necessarily for us to explore, but just for us to look at, to see, because it's for somebody else. And when I show you who it's for, with documentation like this, I think it's an astounding surprise that you'll have. And I think it documents and confirms for us just what you and I and what these things are all about. When we study in our quantum series, and we've been down here looking at quantum physics and talking about quantum physics, and basically the big thing about quantum is the observer. If something is not observed, it doesn't exist. It's very hard for us to understand that. You say, well, the street, the highway outside exists. Well, it does, but in your little world, it does not. The only thing that exists in your little world is what you see right now. If you look at the picture of me, what's beyond that picture? And the only way to be able to find out is close your eyes. That's what's beyond the picture. So all you're looking at is this screen. Nothing else exists in the universe except what you observe. And when you begin to understand that, would you just move that over? When you begin to understand that, you begin to look at one of the real basic tenets of quantum physics. And I'm only bringing that to your attention because we move into the realm of physics, we move into the realm of science when we start understanding the nature of what we call God. And go on to page 727 if you have the Bible there. And on page 727, you go to the book of, it brings you to the book of Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 13, and it basically talks about what the quantum physicist is talking about as far as the observer is concerned. It says in verse 13 of Daniel 4, I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher, and a holy one came down from heaven. And that watcher, that observer, is part of our lives, part of the existence of things, part of the scientific existence of things, part of quantum. So anyhow, where we concluded before we went on vacation, and that's always difficult, so to try to catch up, we were fascinated with the biblical description of those little angelic beings that you see in cards and everything, called cherubim. Cherubim. And if you remember, there was an interest developed because of the similarity to the word cerebrum, which is pronounced cerebrum, cherubim, and cerebrum is the human brain. Everybody has one. I mean, that you don't have to look in a book for. Now, I understand that some people say, well, in different languages, but one of the things to keep in mind is that when you look into medical dictionaries, the words are of Latin origin. And therefore, I think pretty much cerebrum in English is cerebrum just about everywhere because it's of a Latin derivative. Now, I gave you, if you had the very first page of that little document I gave you, the things that when we start looking at relationships of words, you see that if you go under the word cherub there, the word K-E-R, it's derived from K-E-R, cherub, which is the Hebrew of the Babylonian. And if you look down at the last two sentences of that paragraph, an animal masked and costumed priest, the cherubim, probably descended from Shabam Mukarabim, close kindred, guardians of the shrine of the moon goddess at Marib. So they're the guardians of the shrine. They're the ones that took care of the shrine. But look at the similarity of the word. You have cherubim, K-A-R-R-I-B-I-M, and then in Hebrew it becomes kerub, K-E-R-U-B-H, and then as you look at cerebrum, at the very top, which is the human brain, and it talks about the human brain and the mental functions, and it says C-K-E-R, and then when you look under K-E-R, important derivatives, you have Capricorn and cranium and all that business, and then you have cerebrum. So there's a connection there. Now the other interesting thing is if you go down, you see the word cerebrum. If you look at that root of that word, C-E-R-E, you see the dictionary tells us to cover with, or as with wax, to cover over. And then you don't even have to open the Bible, because what I've shown you in Exodus 25:20, I've taken a part of the Bible there, the word cherubim, and the cherubim shall stretch forth their wings on high, covering the mercy seat with their wings. So the cherubim's job was to cover. And the cerebrum is actually the covering, it's the brain and all of that. But the cerebrum, that root of that word, cera, means to cover. So there's a connection there, and there's something that we have to think of. So what is pointing us here is it points us to the brain or the mind. The other interesting thing on this first page that I gave you is if you look under cherub, notice that the Sheban Mukaribim, close kindred garters of the shrine of the moon goddess. Well, the moon goddess actually is named Sin, a view of the Chaldees, and Sin was actually associated with the moon because it relates to the emotions. So here we have the emotions, cerebrum, which is the brain, and cherubim. So all of this points us to the brain, to the mind. Cerebrum, the brain, as you know, cerebrum, the brain, cherubim, and the brain being the temple. And of course the Bible tells us that God lives in a house not made with hands, which would be cerebrum, or the human brain. Now, the cherubim are inside the house, inside the tabernacle, which is inside the human brain. And if you remember when we studied initially, we found out that the tabernacle was made in three sections. You had the outer court, which is the holy place. You had the curtain or veil, and that's separated from the most holy place, which was the inner court. And then remember, when we studied the Stedman's dictionary, we found out that the human brain has an outer court called dura mater, which is hard mother, okay? The innermost part of the brain is called pia mater. One thing I want you to keep in mind, well, I'll tell you this in a second as we go through the labyrinth, separating dura mater from pia mater is arachnoid, which is the veil or the curtain. So then the tabernacle construction in the Bible, outer court, curtain, inner holy place, is the same as the construction of the human brain. Dura mater, arachnoid, pia mater. But this is the interesting thing that you want to keep in mind as we go along through this labyrinth. Dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater do not stop at the brain. Dura mater, arachnoid, and pia mater run from the brain all the way down the spine. Actually, in the spine, there is a dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid. And what you find out as you look at these things is that your brain and your spine are one and continuous. There's no difference between them. So then when you talk about the kundalini impacting the brain and all this kind of business, it's all part of the same thing. All right? So dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid are the brain, which matches up with the temple, and they're also part of the spine. Now the cherubim are within the ark, and they cover what is called the ark of the covenant. And when we'll look at this, and we'll look at the scriptures because you have to see this. What's interesting, in the cerebrum, it's not the cerebrum, it's cerebrum, that's the way it's pronounced. You have a left hemisphere of the brain, and you have a right hemisphere of the brain. Well, in the Bible, the cherubim are at two ends. They're placed at two ends. They're placed at the left, and they're placed at the right, okay? And God dwells between them. That's what the Bible said. God dwells between. Well, between the left and the right, right at the center, is this thing called pineal. Pineal gland of the brain is at the center. So here we have the cerebrum with the left and the right hemisphere. Here we have the cherubim, one at one end, one at the other. And here we have God dwelling at the center between the wings of the cherubim, and there's where the pineal gland of the brain is located, between the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, why is that so important? Well, as we're thinking the anatomy of the brain, and we're thinking the relationship to the Bible and Scriptures, let me show you why that's important. Go to the Bible, go to page 28. So you see this with your own eyes. Look at the book of Genesis, and in Genesis, look at Genesis chapter 32. And in Genesis chapter 32, look at verse 30. Here's why it's so important. Jacob sees God face to face. Jacob says, I have seen God face to face, and I shall call the place Peniel.